The word Vandal today has entirely negative connotations. According to the Oxford Dictionary, it is a person who deliberately destroys or damages property belonging to others. When it comes to the Germanic Vandals, whose late antique migrations took them from southern Poland across the Western Roman Empire and into North Africa via Spain, this description is not exactly untrue, especially given that they did indeed sack the city of Rome in 455 AD. However, the Vandals were only one of a number of Germanic tribes who moved into the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, forced into a wholesale westward migration by the Huns. They weren't even the first, nor the only group to sack the Eternal City. Their origins are murky, and their language is all but unknown, their faith something of a mystery, and their way of life hard to discern. However, this group, these Vandals who are so unknown to us, had a colossal impact upon late antique Europe, and in particular upon the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the West, through their establishment of an independent kingdom in North Africa, a kingdom that lasted for almost a century. Therefore today we will endeavour to learn more about this powerful and much feared Germanic people, and answer the question, who were the Vandals? The origins of the Vandals are rather murky, but it is thought that they may have first dwelt in Scandinavia. In particular, this Scandinavian origin is related to the names of two of the tribes identified as being Vandal, the Hasdings and the Sillings. Similarities have been drawn between topographical names across southern Scandinavia, including the parish of Vendel in central Sweden, known as Vandal in Old Swedish, and a region of northern Denmark named Vendsyssel. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, also describes the Vandals as having their roots on the shores of the Baltic Sea. The Vandili, a Gothic race, dwelt originally on the northern coast of Germany, but afterwards settled north of the Marcomanni. Archaeological evidence attests to a good deal of settlement in northern Jutland, with large numbers of villages and burial grounds. However, curiously, these settlements appear to have been abandoned in the 2nd century BC. Furthermore, around the same time, the Przeworsk material culture, closely associated with the Vandals, began to emerge in the regions surrounding the Elbe, Oder and Vistula rivers. The Przeworsk culture is the name given to an Iron Age archaeological culture, named for the first artifacts discovered at excavations near the Polish town of Przeworsk. The culture is primarily distinguished by its burial customs, which mostly consisted of cremation, but did include some examples of inhumation. These burials, a number of which are warrior graves, often contain elaborate burial gifts such as riding tackle and spurs, an interesting discovery since Vandalic war parties are noted for their extensive use of cavalry. Although it encompassed a very wide area, and no doubt included Germanic, Celtic and Proto-Slavonic peoples, the Przeworsk culture is heavily associated with Germanic tribes in particular, especially the Vandals. Although it cannot be stated with any degree of certainty, it may well be that the Vandals migrated en masse from their original home in Scandinavia, down the Baltic coast and into the historical regions of Galicia and Silesia in modern-day Poland and western Ukraine, which became the heartlands of Vandal territory. In the establishment of their territory, the Vandals came into conflict with the Goths and Langobards, who were also in a period of migratory movement. There appears to have been skirmishes with Celtic tribes in the region too, namely the Boii, a remnant of whom remained in the area. In defeating these Celts, the Vandals established their territory. I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Incogni. Now, in this, the year 2024 AD, I think we're all at least somewhat aware of how our data is being collected and sold online. So-called data brokers collect our personal information, our names, addresses, employment history, online activity, and even our social security numbers and other financial identifiers, and sell them to businesses. Ever wondered how those intensely irritating automated spam callers keep getting a hold of your number? The answer is data brokers. However, beyond irritating calls and other intrusive advertising practices, there's always a risk that this personal information could fall into the hands of modern-day vandals, cybercriminals who would use such information to apply for bogus loans, for example. That's where Incogni comes in. Incogni contacts data brokers directly and requests they remove your personal data from their records. But they don't just stop there. Incogni submits repeated requests to brokers to ensure that your data stays off of data broker records. The process is simple. Create an account, grant Incogni permission to contact data brokers on your behalf, and let them get to work protecting your personal data. If you're in the UK, US, Canada, or the EU, you can use the link in the top comment below or in the description box. Now, let us rewind about 2,000 years, back to Europe in antiquity. Defining who the Vandals were is a rather difficult question, largely owing to a lack of sources. However, this situation is further complicated by the fact that tribal identities were not surefire delineations, but rather quite fluid constructs. Although often based on an ethnicity, tribal identity was, in the words of Jakobsen, more a question of attitude than a question of race and ethnicity. A number of tribes have been identified as Vandal, or as a part of the Vandalic Confederation, which we will now discuss. The Silingi, mentioned earlier, were part of a wider Vandalic group who crossed the Rhine in 406, and whom the geographer Claudius Ptolemy situates south of the Semnones. This would place them just north of the Carpathian Mountains, in the region known to us as Silesia. The other most prominent Vandalic group was the Hasdingi, who participated in the Marcomanni Wars on the Roman side, a series of conflicts in which the Germanic Marcomanni and Cadi peoples invaded Roman territory across the Danube frontier. One other group which is likely Vandal is the Lugi. Strangely, some Roman sources mention the Vandals and omit the Lugi, such as Pliny the Elder, and others mention the Lugi but not the Vandals, such as Strabo and Cassius Dio. Indeed, Tacitus mentions the Lugi as the main ethnic group in the region, and that their subtribes included the Hari and the Naharnavali. However, these people shared a material culture, and are described as living in the same regions, the area between the Vistula and the Oder River, in the upper reaches of those two torrents. This leads to the conclusion by scholars that these groups were effectively synonymous. Certainly, it is easy to see how antique Roman authors, lacking detailed information on the complex tribal delineations within the depths of the interior of Germania, might have confused groups. It may be that Lugi was simply an alternative name for the Vandals, or that the Vandals were the dominant tribe within a Lugi tribal confederation. Amongst the earliest mentions of the Vandals is a reference to the Lugi joining in the wars of the Marcomanni Confederation against the Cadi king Vannius in 50 AD. Vannius's territory, situated in modern-day Slovakia and Moravia, was located on the Amber Trail, and it was likely for control of this lucrative trade route that the Lugi were fighting. Later, around the year 92 AD, the Roman historian Cassius Dio noted that the Lugi formed a temporary alliance with the Romans against the Suebi. The Emperor Domitian supposedly even dispatched horsemen to aid the Lugi in battle. The Marcomannic Wars, a series of conflicts lasting from 166 to 180 AD, in which Germanic Cadi and Marcomanni tribes crossed the Danube and invaded the empire, may perhaps have been precipitated to some extent by the migrations of other Germanic tribes, including the Goths and Vandals. The southern movements of the Vandals into Bohemia and Moravia created political upheaval, forcing tribes such as the Marcomanni across the Danube frontier in search of new homelands. During these conflicts, it appears that the Hasdingi Vandals forged an alliance with the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Cassius Dio described how the Roman governor Sextus Cornelius Clemens used a little of the old divide and conquer technique in order to tame the Germanic tribes in Dacia, first encouraging the Hasdingi Vandals, here named the Astingi, to defeat the resident tribe, the Kostoboki, before allowing the allied Lacringi to turn on the Hastingi. The Lacringi, fearing that Clemens out of dread might lead these newcomers into the land which they were inhabiting, attacked them off their guard and won a decisive victory. As a result, the Astingi committed no further deeds displaying hostility to the Romans. The Marcomannic Wars brought the Vandals close to the Roman sphere of influence, and was followed by a period of relative peace. A peace that was shattered by the joint Vandal-Sarmatian invasion of Roman Pannonia in 270 to 271 AD. Although we know nothing of the reason for this invasion, the Greek writer Dexippus details how the Germanic tribesmen were vanquished by the Emperor Aurelian and sent packing back to Dacia. Further incursions by the Silingi Vandals, allied with the Burgundians, were were repulsed by the Emperor Probus in the late 270s. Intriguingly, part of Aurelian's peace settlement was the condition that the Vandals were to provide troops to the Romans, known as foederati. In this case, 2,000 Vandalic horsemen, suggesting that the Vandals were by this point well known for their cavalry prowess. Vandalic wars with the Romans were somewhat sporadic, but relatively well recorded by Roman sources. However, it is likely that the vast majority of the conflict engaged in by the Vandals in this early period was with their Germanic neighbours. The Sarmatian Iazyges to the south, the Suebi and Cadi to the south and west, the Lacringi to the south, and beyond them the Sarmatian Roxolani. The Gepids dwelt beyond the Carpathian Mountains to the north, and the Gothic Tervingi to the east. Of these wars, those with the Goths may well have been the most fierce and the most protracted. By the later 4th century, the Vandals appeared to be relatively entrenched in their lands in modern Poland and Ukraine. However, all this would change with the arrival in Europe of a group who would throw the Germanic tribes into westward migration, great movements which would lead to the destabilization and eventual collapse of the Roman Empire in the west, the Huns. We shall return to this later. For now, we shall discuss the culture of the Vandals. It will perhaps not be surprising to learn that the Vandals, like many other Germanic tribes, organised their society around the institution of monarchy. However, like many of the Germanic tribes, kingship was not the absolute autarky that may be more readily associated with high medieval Europe. Rather, Germanic, and by extension Vandalic kings, ruled in a far more consensual manner. By this, I mean that they were largely beholden to the wishes of their nobles, over whom they theoretically exercised authority. The 3rd century Greek historian Dexippus, in his narrative on the Scythian War of 270, described how the Vandal kings could not come to terms with the Emperor Aurelian without first gaining the assent of their nobles. Kingship was therefore a rather more loose institution than it was in the medieval period. Vandal kings may have been chosen or elected for short periods of time to create unity and provide leadership in times of crisis. Chief amongst these was war. Vandal chieftains would often appoint kings from amongst their number to lead military campaigns for a season. Similarly, confederations of tribes may have appointed over-kings to coordinate the disparate forces. It may well be that the Vandal king Godegisel, who led the Vandal confederacy during their migratory movements to Gaul, was a kind of temporarily appointed over-king. That said, if powerful enough in comparison to their nobles, Vandal kings certainly exercised supreme power. Vandal kings, like other Germanic kings, likely had a religious function, and a religious significance too, acting as spiritual leaders of a fashion. The apparent existence of dual kings or twin kings amongst the Vandals may be an element of this. The Langobard historian Paul the Deacon mentions the dual kings of the Vandals named Ambri and Assi, who led the Vandalic armies in their conflicts with the Langobards. It has been suggested that this dual kingship is a reflection of the Vandals' worship of the Alki, a pair of divine brothers associated with Elk, to which we will return later. During their later period of kingship in Africa, Vandal kings appear to have adopted the trappings of Roman imperialism, wearing purple cloaks and donning a cuirass and diadem, while still retaining elements of Germanic appearance, such as long hair. The primary Vandal administrative unit was the Thousandship, groups of 1,000 men stewarded by an official known as a Chiliarch, who administered these men and their families in legal, financial, and military matters. It may well be that these Thousandships represented the subdivisions within Vandal tribes. Later, once the Vandals had established their kingdom in North Africa, their rulers were client kings of the Roman emperors, and Roman officials continued to function within North Africa, albeit with far less power and prestige than they previously held. Vandal settlement in Europe likely followed a similar pattern to other contemporary Germanic tribes, with economic activity largely based on subsistence farming. Settlement was therefore primarily based around small rural villages, most often situated in fertile river valleys. Excavations at Tarnowik in Poland revealed a Vandal village comprised of dozens of houses, constructed of wood or wattle and daub. Wattle and daub is a basic but effective building technique, utilising wicker upright walls strengthened with layers of clay to provide rigidity and protection against the elements. For the most part, these houses contained one or two large rooms, which families would inhabit together. Vandal sites have also yielded many farming implements, like sickles and ploughshares, with which Vandal farmers would have cultivated cereals, pulses, and vegetables. Animal husbandry too played a major role in Vandalic agriculture. Sheep were kept for their wool, and cattle and pigs provided meat. Notably, cattle and pigs could also happily graze in woodland, which would have covered much of southern Poland and Germany in antiquity. Although their economy was primarily based around agriculture, the Vandals were responsible for producing quality metalwork. The discovery of apparent smithies at Tarnowic attests to this. Although objects such as decorative bronze brooches, known as fibulas, were produced in large numbers, weaponsmithing was perhaps the most important form of metalworking to the Vandals. We do not readily associate barbarian tribes along the Roman frontiers with trade activity, yet trade appears to have been an important part of economic activity for the Vandals. However, this is not to say that the Vandals themselves engaged heavily in trading expeditions to far-flung corners of the empire. Rather, trade was important to Vandal economic activity chiefly because one of the primary north-south trade routes, known as the Amber Trail, passed through the heart of their territory. Beginning on the shores of the Baltic around the Gulf of Finland and reaching the empire via the city of Carnuntum on the banks of the Danube, the Amber Trail, as the name suggests, was the primary route for the flow of amber, furs, and honey into the Roman Empire. The trade in Baltic amber was a very ancient and far-reaching one. Baltic amber beads were found on the breast ornaments of Pharaoh Tutankhamun in the 14th century BC. Even if they were not active participants in long-distance trading, the presence of such a lucrative route in their lands would have benefited the Vandals enormously, as they would have been able to levy tolls upon passing merchants. It also meant that the Vandals would have had easy access to products passing south along this route, as well as Roman products flowing northwards. It is thought that the Roman-style shortsword came to the Vandals in this way. Vandalic trade in North Africa primarily consisted of olive oil, grain, wild animals, pottery, horses, and marble. Although this trade no doubt greatly benefited the Vandals, the economy of the North African provinces certainly declined enormously from its Roman heyday. The upheaval of the Vandal conquest would have seen a marked reduction in trade, and Vandalic raiding across the Mediterranean would have only compounded matters. The Vandal sack of Rome and steady decline of the Western Roman Empire effectively destroyed demand for many of the goods coming out of North Africa. Warfare was apparently an important part of society for the Germanic tribes of antiquity, and the Vandals were certainly no different. What sources we have attest to the fact that wars engaged in by the Vandals were usually short and resolved by the fighting of a single battle. The agricultural societies of these Germanic tribes, with the vast majority of the population involved in subsistence farming, restricted large-scale warfare to a relatively short campaigning season. Vandalic war parties were organised around the administrative unit of the thousandship, nominally 1,000 men. The Vandals favoured fighting on horseback, and their weaponry was accordingly suited to this task. Lances for spearing opponents, and double-edged longswords with sufficient reach to engage infantry targets. Armour, like most Germanic tribes of antiquity, was almost entirely shunned, although Vandalic shields have been found. However, later in their history, Vandal nobles began to adopt the use of mail shirts and lamellar armour. Bows and arrows were not used at all in warfare, being instead restricted to hunting. In the words of Procopius, "Nor were they accustomed to dismounting and fighting as infantry. It was therefore best to fight them from a fortified city or camp to which it would be possible to retreat." Aside from an emphasis on cavalry, we know almost nothing of Vandal military strategies. This may be because, according to the Emperor Maurice, they lacked anything approaching a cohesive command. In his Strategikon, Maurice describes the Germanic tribes thus: "Either on horseback or on foot, they are impetuous and undisciplined in charging, as if they were the only people in the world who are not cowards. They are disobedient to their leaders. They are not interested in anything at all complicated, and pay little attention to external security and their own advantage. They despise good order, especially on horseback. They are easily corrupted by money, greedy as they are." Like the other Germanic tribes, the Vandals had virtually no capacity to carry out siege warfare, and did not make use of reserves in battlefield deployment. Instead, the Vandals were likely to have leaned heavily into their cavalry, attacking quickly and en masse, hoping to overwhelm the enemy, and engaging in flanking maneuvers with their fast-paced troops. Vandal religion in antiquity appears to have been similar to the practice of other Germanic tribes. Worship of a pantheon of gods was central to their faith, and the gods were held to dwell throughout the natural world, in rivers, mountains, and woodland groves. The deities worshipped by the Vandals were generally the traditional Germanic deities. Nerthus, an earth goddess, whose worship involved the drawing of a sacred chariot throughout the land to the great acclaim of the people. Freya, the goddess of fertility. Tyr, the god of assemblies and law. Donar, the lord of thunder, better known as the mighty Thor. Wodan or Wotan, also known as Odin, god of war and magic, often depicted as ruler of the gods, and held by many peoples to have been their founding father. As mentioned earlier, some of the tribes amongst the Vandals worshipped gods known as the Alki, a pair of divine brothers whose name may derive from the Proto-Germanic word for elk. The imagery of these divine twins is a very ancient one, common to many Proto-Indo-European mythologies. Moreover, these divine twins were very often depicted as horsemen. The Alki are compared by the Roman historian Tacitus to the Roman gods Castor and Pollux, divinities who were also heavily associated with horsemanship. Among the Naharvalians is shown a grove, sacred to devotion, extremely ancient. Over it a priest presides, apparelled like a woman. But according to the explication of the Romans, 'tis Castor and Pollux who are here worshipped. This divinity is named Alcis. There are indeed no images here, no traces of extraneous superstition, yet their devotion is addressed to young men and to brothers. It would therefore appear from this segment of Tacitus that priests existed amongst the Vandals, and ministered to the religious needs of the population, although this cannot be stated with any real certainty. The 4th century brought with it an enormous change for the tribes of southern Germania, in the form of the spread of the Christian religion. It is not known exactly how Christianity came to the Vandals, but it is thought that the Gothic missionary, Ulfilas, the son of captive Christians brought north of the Danube by Gothic raiders, was ultimately responsible. Ulfilas, who translated the Bible into the Gothic language and was appointed as a bishop by the Romans in 431 AD, undertook decades of missionary work north of the Danube. The slow spread of Christianity throughout the Gothic and then Vandal territory likely occurred during the second half of the 4th century. Initially, conversion efforts in all probability were focused on the aristocracy and tribal kings, not only because these elites were the spiritual leaders of their people, but also because their support could provide Christian missionaries with the political protection and physical resources to carry out their conversion efforts. The conversion of the wider Vandal peoples to Christianity was surely a much more gradual process, achieved by a combination of missionary work and the slow Christianization of Vandalic tribal society. In any case, conversion appears to have been largely achieved by the end of the 4th century. The priest Salvian reports that the Vandals were Arian Christians by the time they arrived in Spain in late 409 AD. Christianity brought with it a change in burial practices, from cremation to inhumation of the dead, often with grave goods. Men were customarily buried with weapons and tools, women with needles, jewellery and other items. The wealthiest individuals in Vandal society were buried with prestigious items such as imported Roman wares, drinking bowls, bronze objects and pottery. When we speak of the Vandals converting to Christianity, we must recognise the disparate and fluid nature of Christian belief in the 4th century AD. Christian orthodoxy was, at this point, still heavily debated, and there existed a great number of theological variations which caused a great deal of controversy. Some of these beliefs, which at one time or another were defined as heresies and declared anathema, were extremely popular and vied with Catholic belief for supremacy in the Church. Great amongst these was Arianism. Initially espoused by the priest Arius, an Egyptian from Alexandria who lived from 250 to 336 AD, Arianism's chief departure from Catholic orthodoxy was that Jesus had been created by God. God himself was eternal and uncreated, and was therefore spiritually superior to Christ, as he had begotten Christ. The Holy Spirit, in turn, had been created by Jesus, and was therefore spiritually inferior to both Christ and God. While this difference may appear negligible on the surface, it had enormous theological ramifications, and was markedly different from the Orthodox belief which was codified at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. This Nicene Christianity, as it was known, instead held that God existed in the Trinity as three persons, co-eternal and consubstantial, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. According to the orthodoxy agreed at Nicaea, neither Christ nor the Spirit had been made by God, but had always existed. As a result, the teachings of Arius were rejected as heretical, although it was not until the Second Ecumenical Council of 381 AD that Arianism was formally declared as a heresy. Arianism is significant to us because the Gothic missionary Ulfilas was an Arian, at a time when the creed was still viewed as relatively acceptable within the Roman Empire. As a result, it was this form of Christianity, rather than Catholicism, that was spread amongst the Goths and then the Vandals. What is rather intriguing is that the Vandals clung to their Arian beliefs, even as Arianism was declared a heresy and expunged from the Roman Empire. Various reasons for this have been suggested, amongst them the idea that the Vandals did not truly understand the subtle theological differences between their belief and the beliefs of Orthodox Catholics, and therefore did not care to change them. Another slightly less condescending theory is that the Vandals, and the other Germanic Arians for that matter, saw their Arianism as a marker of Germanic identity, and a self-identifier relating to this. Arianism is not particularly popular within the empire itself, therefore to be a follower of Arianism was to be Germanic. It may be that the two became inextricably linked, in the way that faith so often becomes intrinsically linked to a people or nation. Following the establishment of their kingdom in North Africa, the Vandalic king Gaiseric appears to have gifted the lands and possessions confiscated from the Catholic Church to the Arian clergy amongst the Vandals. The king was the head of the Vandalic Arian Church, with the Bishop of Carthage acting as patriarch, who in turn was supported by an administration very similar to the Catholic Church. Catholics were, for the most part, tolerated, with some notable periods of persecution under certain kings. Very little is known about the Vandal language. What little we do know of it primarily comes from recorded names and words, which are transmitted to us from coinage or from other documents written by Greek or Latin authors. It should be noted that these authors may well have misrepresented the phonemes of the Vandalic language, or used the most similar phoneme sounds available to them in Latin or Greek. Furthermore, our reconstruction of Vandalic names relies quite heavily on Gothic forms, making it rather difficult to assess quite how closely related it was to the Gothic language. That said, Vandalic does appear to be most similar to Gothic, and as such is characterized as an Eastern Germanic tongue. Some theories even suggest that Gothic and Vandalic were the same language, others that the Gothic and Vandalic languages were part of the same language continuum that stretched southwards from the Baltic into the heart of Germania. Little can be said about the language beyond this, and apart from the names of a few kings and political figures, we know of very few Vandalic words. An anti-Arian text from mid-5th century Hippo Regius records the Vandal version of the religious phrase Domine miserere, Lord have mercy. In Vandal, it is Froia Arme. A line in the Latin anthology records a Roman poet complaining about the sound of a Gothic North African language, thought to perhaps be Vandal. Here, cheers or hail is Eils, and eat and drink is Scapia Matzia Iadrinkan. By the year 370 AD, the Huns had reached the Volga River. The aggressive westward expansion of this warlike people from the Central Asian steppe had dire consequences for the Roman Empire and the entirety of Europe itself. The Germanic tribes of Eastern Europe suffered first at the hands of the Huns, in particular the Goths and Alans. Pressured by the onset of the Huns in the east, the Gothic tribes were pushed westwards, increasingly encroaching into Roman territory in search of lands in which they could settle. The 378 Battle of Adrianople, in which the Goths defeated the imperial field army and killed the Emperor Valens, is perhaps the most notable incursion. The final decades of the 4th century were filled with such conflicts. Faced with the onset of desperate neighbouring Germanic tribes fleeing the Huns and seeing the Danube frontier of the Roman Empire seriously weakened, the Vandals appear to have decided upon flight. Uprooting themselves and migrating westwards in around the year 400, the scale of Vandal movement is evident from the historical record, as by 420 AD, the Jeworsk culture appears to have entirely vanished from southern Poland. Crossing the Danube frontier and travelling westwards along the Great River, the Vandals appear to have been acting in concert with Suebi and Alan tribes, forming a loose confederacy. The securing of food supplies and safe settlement within the Roman Empire was the priority, although of course the opportunity for loot was always a temptation. The movement of the Vandals furthered the domino effect of migration occurring across Europe. As they moved westward into the lands of the Burgundians and Alemanni, these people too were displaced and began to move towards Gaul. We must not make the mistake of thinking that such an enormous confederation could have been especially well organised. The sheer numbers of people involved meant that constant movement was required in order to find food, and a plan must not have existed beyond just moving westwards to find safe settlement. The core of these tribes, accompanied by women and children, would have moved slowly, whilst warbands roved ahead in search of plunder and in order to scout the route. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was beset by crises, with the ineffectual Honorius on the imperial throne and barbarian tribes regularly breaching the empire's frontiers. In 401, Stilicho, the most prominent Roman commander of the time, who incidentally may have been half Vandal himself, withdrew Roman troops from the Rhine frontier in order to use them against the Visigoths, who threatened to invade Italy. However, he did not leave the frontier totally undefended, forming an alliance with the local Franks. The winter of 406 was a seminal moment for the Western Roman Empire. Perhaps by boat, or perhaps by foot across the frozen course of the mighty Rhine, tens of thousands of barbarians crossed into Roman Gaul. Cadi, Vandals, Sarmatians, Alans, Gepids, Heruli, Saxons, Burgundians, and Alemanni, according to the historian Jerome. It is thought that the crossing occurred near Mogontiacum, Mainz in modern Germany, as this is the first city that was sacked by the invaders. Once in Gaul, the tribes apparently separated, spreading a trail of destruction across the interior of this rich imperial province. With what remained of the imperial field armies busy dealing with the Gothic invasions of Italy, Gaul was left to its fate. This map, compiled from a list of names which Jerome and other sources identify as having been attacked, gives an idea of the scale of the violence. During this period, it is rather difficult to work out the exact movement of the Vandals, for the usual reasons. Authors' difficulty in identifying the Vandals, scarcity of mentions, and the fact that the Vandals appear to have continued to act in concert with the Alans. In 407, the Roman usurper from the province of Britannia, Constantine III, landed in Gaul, forcing the barbarian invaders south and securing large parts of the province for himself. Pressured by the presence of Constantine, who was named as co-emperor by Honorius in January 409, the Vandals crossed the Pyrenees into Spain in the autumn of that year, along with large numbers of Alans and Suebi. Allying themselves to the rebel Roman governor Gerontius, the tribes defeated a loyalist imperial force before turning their attention to looting the province of Spain. The Spanish bishop Aidatius paints a vivid picture of the misery inflicted upon the region by the Vandals, Alans and Suebi. With the province racked by strife and hunger, the barbarian tribes decided to settle. Perhaps more than anything else because food was becoming scarce. Agreeing a deal with the rebel governor Gerontius, the tribes were given the right to settle in return for defending Spain from attack. The Hasdingi Vandals were granted eastern Galicia, and the Silingi Vandals Baetica. The arrival of the Visigoths in Spain in 414, when they took the city of Barquino, complicated matters for the Vandals. By 418 AD, Visigothic attacks had effectively destroyed the Silingi Vandals and Alans in Spain, with the survivors joining the Hasdingi Vandals in Galicia. Beset by near-constant conflict since their arrival in Spain, attacked by Visigoths and Romans alike, the Vandals, under their king Gaiseric, decided once again upon migration. To return to the north would be madness. Only the south and Roman North Africa lay open to them. Exactly why the Vandals crossed into Africa is debated. The push factors were obvious. Spain was a rather unfriendly place to be by the mid-430s. When it comes to pull factors, Roman historian Procopius explains that the Vandals were in fact invited into North Africa by Bonifacius, Roman governor of the region and one of the two most powerful military leaders in the Western Empire at the time, alongside the general Aetius. Bonifacius may have done so in order to strengthen his position in the brewing Roman civil strife, or to counter the eruption in Moorish raiding that had begun in the late 420s. In the May of 429, the Vandals had gathered at Julia Traducta on the southern coast of Spain. It is from here that they set sail on Roman boats, either supplied by Bonifacius or commandeered by the Vandals themselves. Perhaps numbering some 20 to 25,000 men, the Vandals advanced eastwards through Roman North Africa. Relations with the beleaguered Bonifacius broke down into open hostilities, with the Vandals besieging and finally taking Hippo Regius after defeating the Roman general in battle in 432 AD outside the walls of Carthage. Hippo Regius was the home of the great St. Augustine of Hippo. The aged theologian died 3 months into the siege, on the 28th of August, 430, at the age of 75. Virtually unopposed, the Vandals spread havoc throughout North Africa, taking major cities without great difficulty. Victor of Vita reported that the Vandals even piled corpses about the walls of besieged settlements in order to force the surrender of the inhabitants through disgust and disease. The victory of the Vandals was complete, in the words of Procopius. So the Vandals, having wrested Libya from the Romans in this way, made it their own, and those of the enemy whom they took alive they reduced to slavery and held under guard. Seeing that the continued conflict was futile, the Romans agreed a peace with the Vandalic king Gaiseric in 435 AD, which saw the Vandals handed a large chunk of the province of Numidia. Peace was short-lived, as in 439 Gaiseric stormed and captured the city of Carthage, expelling the local Roman nobility, distributing their property to Vandals, and stripping the Catholic churches of their riches. Gaiseric styled himself as King of Africa, with the Vandals in undisputed control of North Africa. The loss of North Africa was a devastating blow for the Western Roman Empire. The African provinces formed the vast majority of Italy's grain supply, and the loss of such a wealthy province was a disaster for the Western Empire's treasury. Conversely, the Vandals began to grow rich off the trade passing through Carthage. Attempts by the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II to retake North Africa were abortive, and in 442 another peace was agreed, with Gaiseric recognized as a client king of Rome, the first fully independent Germanic kingdom established on former Roman soil. Over the next 3 decades, the Vandals put to sea, raiding vast swathes of the Mediterranean coastline in both the Western and Eastern Roman empires. However, it was political machination in Rome that led to the raid for which the Vandals are perhaps best known and most maligned: the 455 sack of Rome. Emperor Valentinian III was murdered on March 16, 455 AD, likely by followers of the general Aetius, who had been executed on the orders of Valentinian earlier that year. Sensing an opportunity, King Gaiseric mustered his fleet and set sail for Rome. Arriving in June 455, the Vandals found the city undefended. Valentinian's usurper, Petronius Maximus, had been killed by his bodyguard for attempting to flee. The Vandal sack of the city was a slow affair. Over 14 days, Gaiseric's forces extracted every valuable artifact they could find, including the treasures taken by the Emperor Titus from the 71 AD sack of Jerusalem. Surprisingly, the sack does not seem to have been a particularly violent affair, and very few, if any, of ancient Rome's buildings were destroyed. Whether or not this is down to the intercession of Pope Leo, who supposedly offered to provide the Vandals with the city's church treasures in return for sparing Rome's buildings and the lives of its citizens, cannot be said with any certainty. The Vandals returned to North Africa, laden with loot, slaves, and the Empress Eudoxia, who was held as a hostage in Carthage. The indignity of the sack of Rome, combined with the perennial raiding that was occurring throughout the Mediterranean, made the destruction of the Vandalic kingdom a priority for the Romans. Moreover, the Vandals had established control over Corsica and Sardinia in the late 450s. An expedition launched by the Western Roman Emperor Majorian in 460 ended in defeat, and an enormous joint East and Western imperial campaign, reportedly comprised of 100,000 men, ended in disaster when the Vandals destroyed the combined Roman fleet at the Battle of Cap Bon in 468. The following year, the Vandals took the island of Sicily, expanding their territorial control to its greatest ever extent. In the 470s, the Romans ended their attempts to retake Vandal North Africa, with Gaiseric concluding treaties with the Western general Ricimer and the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno. With the deposition of the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a child of 11, the Western Roman Empire, bankrupted and racked by civil strife, finally collapsed. Unable to hold Sicily against the new barbarian rulers of Italy, the Vandals abandoned the island, retaining only the western port of Lilybaeum. In the wake of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Vandals were apparently in their strongest ever position. Masters of their own kingdom, in one of the Mediterranean's richest regions, minting their own coinage and controlling trade throughout their lands, and with peace agreements secured with what remained of the Romans in the east. However, in January 477, King Gaiseric, who had led the Vandals for almost 50 years, from the depths of migratory obscurity to the heights of major political power in the Mediterranean, died. While the decades following Gaiseric's death did not see a sudden decline in the fortunes of the Vandals, his successors apparently lacked his political ability and military determination. Persistent raiding by Moorish tribes beyond the southern border, combined with civil infighting, slowly shrunk the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, and in 491 Lilybaeum in Sicily was lost. However, it was the ascension of the bold and dynamic Eastern Roman Emperor, Justinian the Great, that would spell the end for the Vandals. The fall of the empire in the west was seen as an embarrassment by Eastern emperors. For them, the western provinces were lost territories, lands that belonged rightfully to the imperial crown. Each year that went by in which barbarians controlled these lands was an intolerable stain on Roman prestige. With a peace treaty concluded with the Persians in 532 AD and the overthrow of the Vandal king Hilderic in 430, Justinian suddenly possessed both the military means and a just cause to declare war on the Vandals. In 533 AD, Justinian's forces landed close to Carthage. They found their landing virtually unopposed, as the Vandal usurper Gelimer had sent the majority of his forces to Sardinia to deal with the revolt there. Marshalling an army, Gelimer met the Byzantines, led by the infamous general Belisarius, at the Battle of Addecimum on the 13th of September. Despite initial success, the deaths of Gelimer's brother and nephew broke Vandalic resolve, and their forces fled. A second defeat at the Battle of Tricamarum on the 15th of September spelled the end for the Vandals, with Gelimer finally surrendering to Belisarius. So, 95 years after the capture of Carthage by Gaiseric, the Vandal kingdom was ended. Vandalic North Africa was once again incorporated into the Roman Empire, and the Vandal treasury was removed to Constantinople. A mosaic depicting the defeated Gelimer paying homage to Justinian was added to the Great Imperial Gate in Constantinople, and Belisarius was rewarded with a triumph. The defeated Vandals themselves were scattered. Some fled to Spain and were assimilated into the Gothic kingdoms there. Others fled westwards and were assimilated with Berber tribes. Thousands of Vandalic warriors were pressed into imperial service, forming 5 regiments who were sent to the Persian frontier. No doubt some remained in North Africa, slowly assimilating into the Roman province, which, beset by Moorish raiding following the death of Justinian in 565, finally fell to the Muslim conquests in the 690s AD. In the words of Jakobson, "So the Vandals went the way of many other tribes of the great migrations, into obscurity, when the few remnants were absorbed into the Roman Empire and other tribes." Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these videos, you can find additional content on my Patreon. You can also get early access to future videos and access to deleted scenes, in other words, sections that I cut from the main video.